We're live, and we're sorry we're a little bit late. I tried to blame Roger, but it was actually me.
Nope, not my fault.
So we have a few of our fans already that have actually been waiting, and we're excited about that too because we can answer your questions as they come up, and we'll begin to do that as we kind of get through the episode. Some of the questions we may save through, the end of the show. But last time Roger and I did a show together, we were talking about healthcare policy, healthcare insurance, and criminal justice came up. And the reason it came up is because one of my super fans asked me to talk about criminal justice reform or just the criminal justice system, which, of course, we're not experts on, you and I, but we get to talk about it. And I think you have a very interesting background. And I think what's exciting is just the journalistic life that you've led and how that has exposed you to stuff that maybe the rest of us might not have had much experience with. So with that said, Roger, can I turn the time to you to talk about your experience?
Sure. So, speaking of journalism, one of the techniques in journalism has always been if you have this pile of data and you have research that indicates there are certain reasons to believe that there are certain facts in play, whatever that is. You don't want to turn that into a research paper. I mean, you want to eventually tell a story, make a narrative about it. And so one of the techniques that we've used for a very long time, and it's still maybe overused, and sometimes it's used more and more. It's used in the absence of the data. It's just they're just storytelling, but we will go. And find someone who sort of encapsulates or embodies the story in a truly representative way to create a human connection to raw data and information. In this case, it sort of, for me, it kind of worked backward from that. There's a story here in Idaho Falls that became semi-famous, and I have to say the newspaper did not uncover this story. We probably didn't ever do it justice, but we did catch on to it later in its evolution, but it helps to illustrate, I think, the broader factual truth, which is what we're going to get to when it comes to the American justice system. And I want to say, we all know there's no way to get to perfect justice, right? I mean, that may be, a conceptual objective, but we're never going to get there. The issue is, how do we address the obvious cracks in the system and faults in the system? So I apologize. I am going to refer from time to time to some notes because I want to make sure that I get this story right, and I'm not going to rehearse the entire story, but I think it's a powerful story. I know it's a powerful story, and it helps to put a human face to this broader issue. So in 1996, a young woman in Idaho Falls named Angie Dodd was raped and killed. Brutally murdered in her apartment, stabbed to death. And of course, in any town, that's horrific. In Idaho Falls, you can kid yourself into believing that stuff like that never happens in your little town. So it was quite horrifying, but it went unsolved. And it went unsolved for quite a while, months. As it turns out, I'm going to give away part of the story. It went unsolved for years and years and years. But the police were under increasing pressure, understandably, to find the perpetrator of this terrible crime. I was not yet. I was at this time. I had been the managing editor of the Post Register, which is the newspaper that covers Idaho Falls and a lot of eastern Idaho, in the early '90s. Then I've gone to St. George for 5 years, a town with which you may be familiar. Um, and then I came back to Idaho Falls in the middle of 1998, July of 1998. So this crime happened in 1996, and then in early 1997 they made an arrest. The police made an arrest, and they arrest a. There were a series of false starts or bad starts made to the process, but ultimately they put their hands on a young man by the name of Christopher Tapp. And Christopher Tapp was kind of he ran in the same circles as the victim, knew her and had been seen with her and other people the night before she was murdered. And this was not a particularly sophisticated young man. He ran with a group they called the River Rats. They called themselves the River Rats. They kind of hung out along the Snake River. At any rate, the police brought him in for questioning, and one of the two lead questioners was a police officer by the name of Jared Furman, who later became our mayor. And I got to know Jared later, and he's a very nice man. But at the time, there was this belief among law enforcement that anything was fair game. Any process that you could use to get to a confession or get somebody to cough it up was okay. And this comes from you go back and watch 70s, 80s, 90s police dramas. That was sort of the storyline is, whatever it takes, you lie, you coerce, you mislead, but a confession's a confession, right? A confession, if you get a confession, you're done. And so they brought this Christopher Tapp in, and these long interrogations were recorded, some just with audio, some with audio and video. And years later, going back and looking at them, it's quite stunning, because they would do things like they would ask Christopher Tapp questions, and if he didn't quite answer them the right way, they would go back and say, well, are you sure? Don't you mean... Or, they're talking
Right.
about the interior of a room. Don't you mean that was on the left and not the right? I mean, they would basically lead him into the correct answers. They used all sorts of gimmicky techniques to kind of string him along. And of course, there's a little good cop, bad cop going on, where there's this threat that we're gonna if you don't cooperate, we're going to, it's the classic, help yourself now kind of thing going on. And over this period of interrogations, he changed his story 4 or 5 times, usually at the behest of the interrogating officers. They would sort of suggest something, and he would ultimately kind of go along with it. And sometimes he would even sort of ask them to tell him what to say.
Did he do that because he believed, or they led him to believe, that by, getting on board with their story would somehow help him
Yes,
out of
not
the
only that,
situation?
but they offered him an immunity agreement that he signed on to, which was later revoked because immunity agreements are based on telling the truth, and they said, well, you didn't tell us the truth, therefore your immunity agreement is off the table. All of which came into play much later down the road. So ultimately, he confesses to various pieces of the crime. But here's the really important backstory. By this point, 1996, DNA is commonly used in forensic police work. And so they had his DNA. They had the DNA from the victim. It didn't fit. It didn't match him. It didn't match the first person that he pointed the finger at, because he was sort of doing whatever he thought was necessary to get the thing done, to get to the end of the process. And there were other tactics used, like, not letting him go to the bathroom and all this kind of stuff. So ultimately, even though his DNA is not found on the scene or on the victim, he confesses to participating in the rape and in participating in the murder. The police know at this point that there is a perpetrator out there somewhere that they have not yet identified. They have DNA of someone that they can't find. Mm-hmm. They know that at this point. However, they had their guy, so far as they were concerned, and they got their confession. And so he went to trial in May of 1998. The trial took less than about 2 weeks. Most of the trial was about replaying his confessions, his various confessions.
Oh.
He did not testify. By that time, he had recounted his confession or confessions. But who would confess to something he or she didn't do? Nobody, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to address that here later on. But so the jury, probably quite understandably, maybe you and I would have also on that jury done the same thing. They voted a conviction, and he was sentenced to life in prison plus 10 years for his alleged participation in the rape. Now, there was in the trial a witness who gave him an alibi. The prosecutors attacked the witnesses who gave him the alibi. At the end of the process, his confession is what got him convicted, even though he recanted, even though the process was what it was. But nobody saw the full interrogation process at that time. Not his defense attorney, not the. I mean, you might call that exculpatory evidence. I'm not an attorney, but no one saw it except the police knew that it was there. He was convicted. I became the publisher of the Post-Register about 5 weeks after this whole thing happened, and I will tell you, I did not really even know about it. I knew there was this crime. I knew that someone had been convicted, and that's kind of all I knew. And so he went to prison. The police still knew that there was another perpetrator out there, but the investigation really didn't. There was very little that happened after that, because so far as they were concerned, they had their guy done. So, give or take, 15 years passed. And Christopher Tapp, his appeals have run out. He's in prison. And at some point, and I'm now going to introduce you to the hero of the story. Angie Dodge's mother, Carol. At some point, she was initially enraged by Christopher Tapp, wanted him to, go away, was convinced that he was guilty. She decided there were a number of things that happened that had caused her to wonder. And so she went and reviewed all of the video and audio tapes of the
Oh.
investigatory interviews.
The victim's mother did.
The victim's mother,
Now,
Carol
why
Dodge.
and why again did she feel a need to do that? He's in prison.
And but there were just, increasingly there were questions, and there were people. So the Idaho Innocence Project, the American Innocence Project became aware of the situation. They don't take on very many cases, but they started looking into it and started, trying to understand it. And this was about the time that the newspaper started to get interested in it again, because we started getting wind. I talked to people, and our editor and others talked to people who were starting to say, hey, there's something wrong here. There's something not right. So Carol spent hours and hours and hours and hours. And imagine this: you're the mother of the victim, and you're sitting through these horrible tapes of the interrogation of this young man who you are convinced was at least one of the people responsible for your daughter's violent death. After she did that, she came away and said he didn't do it. He didn't do it. And she's the one who became his strongest advocate. She began blowing the whistle and connecting with the Innocent Project people and anybody who would listen to her, including me. She wanted us to know that something was terribly, terribly wrong.
Could you see that there was something wrong when she came to you, and
yes,
how did you react?
Yes. So horrified, kind of disappointed at ourselves that we hadn't, picked up on it sooner. But just, you could tell that, and so we got involved, and we started writing stories, and we started writing opinions on the editorial page saying that something's very, very wrong here, and this case needs to be reopened. Well, the local prosecutors didn't want to reopen it. The state didn't want to reopen it. There was, and because everybody says they're innocent at some point, and so I think you just get used to the idea that, well, it's just another one of those people who got caught, right? So,
boy, this show just got serious with those glasses.
Yeah, these I put these on when I'm teaching to look more academic, but I also need them to read sometimes. So I'm going through. I have some notes here on how this unfolded, and I want to make sure I get it right. At one point, the Idaho Supreme Court in 2001 ruled that Tapp's Miranda rights had been violated, but that it didn't matter. I'm just going to let that sit there for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
The Idaho Innocence Project started looking into it in 2007. Ultimately, and it took for a long time to get access to the full set of tapes. Thankfully, they weren't destroyed, but everything moved very, very slowly because there was no sense of urgency. They had their guy, and so she contacted a man by the name of Steve Dreisen, who is sort of an expert in false confessions. And so when you hear the term false confessions, you say to yourself, what? I mean, it's either false or it's a confession. But he had done a lot of research into this phenomenon, and it is actually incredibly common, even for capital cases,
mm-hmm.
even for murder cases. And I'll get to that here in a moment. But finally, in 2015 or so, a local public defender, God bless him, public defenders underpaid, overworked, hated by by everybody. But a guy by the name of John Thomas, who was a local public defender, took up the case and became his top priority. And he began filing motions. He began, joining Carol in shouting about there's something terribly, terribly wrong here. At the same time, they began negotiating with the prosecutor's office on how do we, there was an increasing sense by all parties that something wasn't quite right here. But the prosecutors were not at that point. And, of course, a prosecutor is an elected position, and they tend, they want to be tough on crime, So there's, you're not going to get very many prosecutors, even though this was not the prosecutor who had been involved in the initial case. But they want to be those tough people, and they don't want to be the one who lets somebody out. However, they began negotiating, and ultimately, they came up with a deal where they would vacate or move to vacate the rape charge against Christopher Tapp, and they would allow him his sentence for the murder to be reduced to time served. Okay, we're now 18 years in.
Wow.
Wow. And then about this time, one of the witnesses who had been a star witness in the initial trial, who had told police that Tapp had been at the scene, and I won't go into the details, but recanted her testimony and said that the police essentially told her what to say.
Wow.
This was now 2017, 19 years later.
Wow.
21 years later now. Anyway, so this began to snowball, all of this stuff going on. All of it mostly because of Carol Dodge, the mother of the victim, who had gotten everything going. So Christopher Tapp agreed to sign the deal. He wanted to get out. 21 years in prison. And so he signed the deal where they would vacate the rape charge, they would reduce his sentence to time served, and he could go out. But he would still be a convicted murderer on the books.
So this is also, the reality is the real killer is still out there.
Still out there. Still, the DNA is on file, available, but hasn't been found. Okay. And pretty much everybody knew this, that the only DNA they had was for someone they hadn't identified. Was
this a jury trial?
Yes.
And did the jury did they not understand DNA? There's no DNA evidence here, and was it too early?
The charge was that he didn't commit the rape per se, but he was a conspirator in its commission. But he had confessed to ultimately committing the murder again, and then recanted. But the fact that his DNA wasn't there kind of didn't matter anymore. We have, and it's
because of all the confessions,
because of the confessions, regardless of the recanting. So far so good, right? So now we have, and I think, again, I don't want to. We were always careful. We tried to talk to some of those jurors. None of them, for understandable reasons, would talk to us. And you know what? You get into the jury room. You've heard a confession. You've heard convincing uh, examination, and you hear the police, who are and they're very good at, they're very good at the process. I don't blame them. I just don't blame them. And at this point, DNA, while not particularly brand new, was still emerging as a forensic tool.
Right.
So to that point, I apologize. I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs here from the Innocence Project's report on what happens next, because it's really, really important to get this right. So bear with me. It'll be worth it, I promise. After Tapp's release, so Christopher Tapp is now out. The Idaho Falls Police, who now had a new police chief and all new folks involved, began working with the Idaho Innocence Project and a technology company called Parabon Nanolabs in an effort to identify the source of the DNA sample. After creating a genetic, now pay attention, this is really amazing. After creating a genetic profile from the sample, Parabon compared it to profiles submitted to genetic databases by people looking to identify relatives or discover their ancestry. We all know what that is, ancestry.com, those databases. A lot of stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of people are probably wishing they had never done that, because it has consequences they might not think about. Starting with profiles in the database, Parabon was able to use other records to build a family tree through the use of genetic genealogy. DNA samples were obtained from 6 persons of interest generated from that tree, men who were roughly the right age and lived in or around Idaho Falls at the time of the murder. All were eliminated as the sources of the semen. The family profile had come up in earlier DNA searches, but not with the precision that Parabon was able to provide. Okay, here's the key paragraph. Then the analysts learned that there was a 7th person of interest in that lineage, a man named Brian Drips. He had lived across the street from Dodge and had been questioned by police early in the investigation before the focus turned to another person and to Tapp. Drip, at this point, lived in Caldwell, which is southwest of Boise. On the other side of the state, the Idaho Falls police surveilled him, waiting for him to leave a DNA sample. Follow this. This is like a cop show. Waiting for him to leave a DNA sample through a discarded cigarette or a drink can. Eventually, they recovered a cigarette butt, which allowed Parabon to compare Drip's DNA with the sample from the crime scene. Parabon reported that Drips was the source of that sample. Drips was brought in for questioning, confessed, and was arrested on May 15th, 2019 for murder and rape. He said he acted alone and did not know Tapp. So ultimately, the DNA came back to connect them to the right person. 21 years later. Eventually, also, Tapp's murder charge was vacated.
So Christopher Tapp was never at the scene. He
never there.
Not an accomplice.
Near the scene. Uninvolved whatsoever. Never there. Knew nothing about it. And if anybody wants to really dig into this, Google Christopher Tapp, and you can dive in as deep as you want and look at listen to the interviews, the whole thing, and you can sort of watch how it unfolds. So
he's alive today, I assume.
He lives here in Idaho Falls. He's married. Here's So he here's the sort of the epilogue to this part of the story. A couple of years ago, the Idaho State Legislature passed a law for compensating wrongly convicted people, and it went to the governor's desk, and he vetoed it. And he had his reasons, but the problem was, at no point during the process of considering the legislation did he voice any concerns about it until it got to his desk. They came back the following year, passed the legislation with some minor changes. It was signed. Since then, Tapp has received $1.2 million from the state of Idaho. He has also filed suit against the Idaho Falls City Police for their total botching of the investigation, of the interrogation, of all of that.
Because he would have lost how many years of his life?
He was in prison for 21 years.
He lost 21 years of his life.
He lost 21 years of his life.
And he
from
went in
20 to 41.
20. So he went in at 20. Wow.
So kind of, for most of us, kind of our most productive, best years.
Yeah, I mean, that's when you get educated, you start your career. I mean, huge loss.
Raise a family.
Huge. Yeah.
All of that. So that's the story of Christopher Tapp, and it's not just a story; it's a human being who's, and you might say, well, that's one screw up. No, it's one of hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands. The Innocence Project has found so far nearly there have been nearly 500 convictions overturned with the use of DNA alone in our country.
Mm-hmm.
500 murder convictions overturned through the use of DNA.
So so just to put a fine point on that, that means that wrongly convicted people, wrongly judged, who are freed, but does it result in finding the real perpetrator? Or
sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes the perpetrator is long dead. Sometimes, in most cases, yes, because this was the first case in which genealogical DNA was used to overturn a conviction. The first time. It's happened since now, but that was the first one. Of the nearly 500 that the Innocence Project is tracking, 360 of those involved false confessions.
Wow.
Here's another just interesting data point. The Urban Institute, in a research paper that it did, found that it based on extrapolation, so taking a smaller data set and then extrapolating outward from that, they estimate that 12% of all convictions in which DNA is now available would be overturned.
Wow. What do you think motivates the police force or prosecutors to drive home a conviction? I mean, there's got to be a misaligned incentive, right? They're incentivized to get a conviction. Is it because they are voted in some cases, or is there some other incentive you're aware of that creates this?
It's a great question, Gary, and I don't understand it. And I've never been, I'm obviously, I've never been a police officer, and they are amazing people who do very, very hard work. I don't know. I know in this case, I know Jared Furman, who was one of the two lead investigators. As I said, he became mayor of Idaho Falls. He later was he has early onset dementia and has disappeared from public life. But I got to know him when he was mayor here, and he's a lovely man. I am quite certain he was convinced he was doing the right thing. It was sort of how they were trained to do it, that whatever it takes, if you get a confession, it's good.
And they don't realize that they're leading the
They
confession.
do. I think, I mean, they clearly knew they were leading that, but they're of this belief that no one would admit to something they didn't do. I really believe it's
Yeah.
not. I really believe they thought they had their guy.
Yeah.
I really do.
Because he is confessing, and so they just go with that, right?
And who would do that? I mean,
Right.
but now with what we know, and this is very recent research, now what we know is it happens all the time, and it tends to happen. Who is it that tends to do this? Okay. Fairly unsophisticated people who are frightened by the system. It tends to involve people who you might say it. If they didn't do this and this one, they did something just as bad, so it doesn't matter. I mean, there's almost that kind of a thought process. I think that goes on is, well, he, whether he did this one or not, it doesn't matter. We caught him this time, and so there are other things that this person needs to be in prison for. And I think that's a part of the rational of the rationalizing that happens in the process. Go ahead.
He didn't ask for an attorney. So, right, like one of the things he could have done is when he's being questioned by the police is, I have the right to remain silent or whatever, and I want an attorney. But
so
is that true?
He did eventually get a public defender. And at one point, but he had a really crappy public defender, not the one who came to his rescue later.
Sure.
Let's face it, there are some times when there are public defenders who are overworked and underpaid, and they just know that this guy probably did it, and so they're going to phone it in. There are public defenders who don't do that, who are amazing.
I just wonder if it's that kind of that marginalized group that they're unsophisticated, uneducated, don't have resources, they don't have an attorney, or they don't think to ask for one, and they're just trying to cooperate with police. I don't know.
And the early questioning was done without an attorney. Later, he had an attorney, but here's how pathetic the legal counsel was that he got. At one point, the police want to take Christopher Tapp to the crime scene and walk him through it. The attorney doesn't go with them.
Wow.
I don't even need to comment on that.
Roger, we have a question. Can I pull it up for you?
Sure.
Do you know this person?
So I'm going to shout out to my sister Kathleen, who is a member of the city council in our hometown of Peru, Indiana, and this is from my sister Kathleen.
So she's asking if he was intellectually challenged. I don't know if you would have known that. Thank you for your question, Kathleen.
So one of the later challenges to the conviction was based on a claim that he was, that he had learning disabilities or what have you. So I don't want to weigh in other than to say that was used later. But I think the larger issue is, what does that mean? And had he had access to proper formal education, etc., would it have gone differently? I don't know. But clearly he was intimidated by the process. And here's another thing about it is that Officer Furman, later Mayor Furman, had at one point been a resource officer in the high school where Christopher Tapp had gone to school. And so Christopher Tapp saw him as sort of this authority figure, this person that he had been aware of. I'm not sure that their paths had ever crossed, but he was at least aware of him. And so there was automatically this sense of that authority figure. And Jared Furman is a tall, handsome man, and, cuts a very imposing figure.
Intimidating a little.
In that case, clearly he was intimidating. And all you have to do is spend a little time with the tapes to know that was on purpose.
And the guy that did get finally convicted, what was his name again? David?
His name was Brian Drips.
Brian Drips. Was he ever questioned at the same time with Taps?
No, they didn't know he existed. I mean, no. I'm mistaken. He was early on. Let me get this right. He was at one point questioned briefly, but not ever considered a suspect.
Wow. So they did question him, and I wonder why.
Let me make sure I've got this right.
Okay, because I just wonder why he was missed. Like, just thinking about social disparities, and if he had resources or.
No, I think my understanding is that he ran in the same crowd as Christopher Tapp. They knew each other. I don't think it was. I just think that, there was never. I'm going to just suppose. I'm just going to that they got their guy, and even though there was somebody else out there, I don't have a reason for why they didn't, stay with it and continue to push. Mm-hmm. I just think everybody figured that was good.
So it reminds me of a Netflix. Actually, in preparation for this, I watched a documentary on the confession killer on Netflix, and it was a case of someone who did commit murder in Texas. The Texas Rangers arrested him, started to interrogate him, and he started confessing to murders he didn't commit, and confessed to like 200, but like 200 across the country. And what you started to see is these sheriffs and these state investigators were wanting to get the cases closed that were on their books, and they started pinning it on this guy, and come to find out, he committed one of, or two or three of the 200 murders. And what really kind of brought that to light was what you just said in terms of DNA. Like, by the time DNA came into being, but I noticed that there were these motivations, like with the sheriff that was most highlighted in the film, was motivated by, his electability. He's an elected official, and he was just becoming this hero, right? Tough on crime. I'm finding all these murders, and it seemed like it kind of went to his head.
And I think that, I don't want to put a blanket over everybody who's involved in this process, but the thing, because of how we function in our popular culture, we think that murders get solved. Well, guess what? A significant number. It varies, but it can be it can be a majority of violent crimes in our country go unsolved. It's not like TV. There isn't a happy ending at the end of every episode. Most violent crimes, or a significant number of violent crimes, thousands and thousands and thousands, go unsolved forever. And so, I guess if you're in the law enforcement, if you're in the justice system, you can understand why you'd like to get some closure on some of these.
Sure.
And if you get someone who can start checking off the boxes for you, I get that. And I think you can start to rationalize a lot of things. And I think that these cops rationalized their process and convinced themselves that it was legit. And it's only kind of in retrospect that you look back at it and say, what were you thinking? I mean, how did you well, that was how it was done. And again, I know Jared Furman. He's not a monster. He's not a bad guy.
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the things that this brings to light is that we have to make it okay to criticize our institutions and not become hyper defensive.
Good luck with
If I'm
that.
well, I mean, we talked about this in healthcare, right? Like it has to be okay to say, we have a problem in healthcare, it's broken, we need to fix the system. That doesn't mean that I'm a bad person or people who work in healthcare are bad people. But it's the same thing with, I would hope, with the police, like police reform, is that, doesn't just because there are problems doesn't mean we can't talk about them and be critical so that we can fix them.
I'm going to tell you another story that I hadn't intended on telling you, but it's about my son Jeremy, who lives here in Idaho Falls, and I think he won't mind if I tell it because he's been pretty public about the process. So he, until about a little less than a year ago, was a teacher at a local middle school. He's now teaching at the Arizona State University prep school, teaching young secondary students who are planning on going to ASU for college. But he was a teacher here, but last summer, one of the dangers, if you are one of my children, is if you get too much time on your hands, you start thinking too much. And I am so very sorry that happens. But so my son had the summer off last, a year ago, a little more than a year ago, and he got involved in the Black Lives Matter movement here in town, and sort of accidentally became one of the leaders of it. But his real passion was police reform. And so he did a lot of research, and he looked into, and his proposal was to create a public police review process, because we have had in our history some questionable shootings, not of innocent people, but of it's we're in America, we're awfully quick to just if someone we're quick to fire their weapons.
Right.
That's our thing. And well, and so he met with the mayor, he met with the police chief, he was sort of patted on the head. Thank you, son, for your information. You don't get it. It was a very discouraging process for him and for anyone who was following it. The mayor here, the current mayor, is a friend of mine, but he was dismissed. My son was dismissed by the mayor and the police chief of police and others, and he became a target for people who didn't like. Because the quick argument is, well, you don't like the police. No, that's not it. That's not it. It's not about defunding the police. It's not about taking the police apart. It's about some reasonable oversight and review. For heaven's sake, it's not. But that's what you go to is the most extreme response to it, and that combined with other issues that my son got involved in the masking in public schools issue, and ultimately he left. He's out. But that was one of the things that he was engaged in that just infuriated people, and of course the police chief and the mayor and others knew that it would be controversial and knew that he would get, tamped down, and so they didn't have to pay him any attention.
What do you mean he left?
He quit the job. He quit teaching, and he went to teaching. He now teaches fully online.
Okay.
Gets paid more money, gets better benefits, works for Arizona State University, but he quit public teaching.
Hmm.
And he
You know,
was
it's
great.
he was what?
He was great. He
Yeah.
was a great teacher. He had parents who would find people would people at a party would come up to me and ask me if Jeremy was my son. Well, Plotho, if it's Plotho, it's us. So yeah, they would talk about how he had changed their child's life.
Yeah, you know, I think it's very important. Part of the purpose of topic discuss is not just that we are going to take a topic and discuss it, but we're actually talking about difficult topics, controversial even, and discussing them with our critical thinking lens on. And part of critical thinking is going to include critically analyzing history, documentary evidence. It's going to include critical inquiry into our institutions and organizations for the purpose of making things better and for the purpose of like we've tried to do with your work in terms of media literacy and coming to a place where we can make rational decisions and figure out how to learn together and live together.
To that point, I want to finish this off with some final data. So back in the 60s, there was a guy, and I'm not going to provide because I don't have I don't have the names and such in front of me, but there was a guy who a judge who began looking into sentencing, how sentencing, and this we're talking about federal sentencing now. So
Yes.
across the country, how sentencing was done, and he did a lot of research and learned that sentencing for precisely the same crimes and very similar conditions and circumstances varied widely across the country based on judicial discretion.
Mhm.
And it's no surprise that people of color would likely get harsher sentences. People in certain jurisdictions would get harsher sentences. Not only that, ultimately, additional research found that if you were a judge, let's just take Dallas, and you're in court on a Monday morning preparing to sentence someone, and the Cowboys lost the day before, you were more likely to deliver a harsher sentence than if the Cowboys had won the day before.
And there were
If the
statistics.
temperature if the temperature was hotter than usual, you were more likely to deliver a harsher sentence. If it was near lunchtime and you were hungry, this all comes out of the book Noise, which I've recommended to your folks, your audience
Yes.
before. I can't recommend it highly enough, and so ultimately, something called the U.S. Sentencing Commission was created in 1984. And the idea was to review the sentencing process and try to get it more uniform to where we don't have these huge disparities between. And so, one person gets 6 months and one person gets 6 years, and that was going on. So, and that was well and good. And the U.S. Sentencing Commission still exists, but in 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that that process had to become advisory and could not have the impact of law. You could it was just an advisory process. Well, if you go onto the U.S. Sentencing Commission's website today, any guesses how many commissioners there are currently serving on the U.S. Sentencing Commission?
What?
Zero. Zero. We have
So how
not
do you
had. They don't.
how do you
They
have
have
a
a staff.
commission?
They have a staff of 100. They have no commissioners. Zero.
Wow.
None.
Wha- That's mind blowing. And what do you know
Um,
why?
yeah, it's a political hot potato. Nobody wants to they have to be. There's a rule where there are, I think there are 7 commissioners, and no more than 4 can be of one political party. Even though
Okay.
it's advisory, even though they've lost the teeth, uh, the Congress has not named any commissioners. They are out. They're gone. They're done. Zero. And so it's completely unfunctioning.
So interesting. And so this does very hit squarely at what one of our audience members really wanted to also hear about, which was, kind of the sentencing and how in our criminal justice system sentencing even works. So this is really
Judges want
interesting
to feel
data.
like they can look at a circumstance and they can apply their discretion humanely and appropriately. The truth of the matter is they can't. They don't. They're terrible at it. They're human beings.
Right.
You know,
That's right.
they get to wear robes, and in England they get to wear pretty wigs. And I don't mean to make fun of judges because that's not my point.
Yeah. It's
But
the institution that needs
the
reforming.
we this is we should all be horrified that a black person in South Carolina is almost certainly likely to get a much harsher sentence for the same crime under the same situation as a white person in Seattle.
Yeah, exactly. Or
Sorry.
marijuana possession and a harsh sentence
How
for
many how
that.
many people are still in prison over something that is now mostly legal, and if it's not legal, it's not prosecuted
Right.
just because culture has changed.
Yeah,
You know,
it's astonishing.
yeah. So that, the point is, we can do better, and we need to do better, and it's not a small thing. It's not trivial. These are human lives, and Christopher Tapp lost 21 years of his life for something that he didn't do. And there are lots of Christopher Tapps still in prison.
So a significant hero that we want to shout out in this whole story is the victim's mother.
Carol Dodge. And so one of the last events that in a former life, that I put together in 2019 was called Women of Influence. And so we honored women of Eastern Idaho. And in most cases, I had a committee of women, because it's, like women of influence. And so what you don't need is a bunch of dudes deciding that. But I pulled rank and awarded and brought Carol in and gave her the sort of the equivalent of the lifetime achievement honor, because she needed to be recognized. It's a stunning thing what she did. And if
Right.
she might still be willing to talk about it. If you might have her on and just
Yeah.
have her tell, it's an amazing story, and she's just the most wonderful person. And I remember her calling me quite a bit, haranguing me to get on it. You guys need to get on this thing, and this is wrong. We've got to do something. God bless her.
If you have some way to connect us and you could join us on an episode, I would love to do a follow-up.
I'll probably have, so my wife Kathleen, the other Kathleen Plotho in my life, knows is quite good friends with Carol, and I'll see if Kathleen Kathleen will ask her if she'd be interested. She, I wouldn't blame her if she's kind of done with that, but
Sure.
if not, it would be she's just one of the great people.
Well, and we want more women of influence on the podcast anyway. I have a disproportionate share of men watching my show. No surprise. So I do want to be intentional about influential women on my show.
Great. I'll let you know.
Okay. Just as we kind of wrap up, is there anything else you want us to know about the story?
Well, I guess, we could call it a happy ending, but it's not it's not happy. It's dreadful. And I guess, I hopefully it can provide motivation for somebody, all of us, to pay more attention, to not consider this stuff trivial, and to have an impact where we can, to use it as a motivator to do something. That's all. It's an interesting story, but it needs to be a story that causes change.
Yeah, we need to be willing to make change. And really quick question for you as we wrap up. So you were the journalist, or you had a journalist hat on when you were working with this case, right? That's how you got as involved as you did. And I think a curiosity that some of my audience members have is, what other kinds of journalistic cases, or just interesting, and maybe this is a longer discussion, but I think there's some interest in the different stories you've been involved in that might be.
You're just killing me here, because you know that I'm a sucker for that. But there's one in particular, and that's the story of a series of stories we did called Scouts Honor, which was about molestation of Boy Scouts in eastern Idaho, and it is the single most significant journalism I was ever involved with, and
you can't bring that up, and then you have to commit to come.
I'm going to tease it because I will be willing to come back to talk about that one. It's a whole other story, and it's stunning and breathtaking and amazing, and there are a couple of heroes in that one that you just can't believe. You can't believe it.
Okay. Thank you so much, Roger. Your time is so valuable, and you've got a little gift on its way. I don't know if you've received the merch I sent you, but some Topic Discuss merch is on its way to you.
I haven't received it yet, but the next time I will have it with me.
Okay.
Whatever it is.
Yeah, I think you can. I think you'll be able to put some drink in it. We'll put it that way.
Oh, perfect.
Okay. So, and thank you for all of our audience members and for joining us live. And we'll catch you on another episode of Topic Discuss. Peace out.
Thanks.
Hey, Roger, can I talk to you for just a second after the show?
Sure.